The Wilson family never thought a simple wooden bench would ignite a war. It wasn't extravagant, not an eyesore, not something that could possibly disrupt the harmony of the neighborhood. It was just a quiet, understated memorial, a tribute to their late son Ethan, taken from them far too soon. The pain of losing a child was something no parent should endure, but here they were, navigating a life without his laughter, his voice, his presence. The bench sat beneath the old oak tree in their front yard, a spot where Ethan had loved to play. It bore his name, delicately carved into the backrest, alongside a small inscription, "Forever our sunshine." Every morning, Mrs. Wilson would step outside with a steaming cup of coffee, sit on the bench, and let her fingers trace the letters of her son's name. Some days, she spoke to him as if he were still there, telling him about her day, about the way his father had started fixing the old car they once planned to restore together. Some days, she sat in silence, letting the cool morning air mix with her grief. Mr. Wilson, a man of quiet strength, wasn't much for words, but sometimes he would come out and place a hand on her shoulder, his other resting on the bench as if touching it brought him closer to the son he'd lost. It wasn't much, this ritual of theirs, but it kept Ethan's memory alive. And then, one day, an envelope arrived. It was stark white, bearing the official Homeowners Association logo in the corner. At first, Mrs. Wilson thought nothing of it, assuming it was another update about landscaping regulations or a reminder about upcoming fees. But when she opened it, her hands began to tremble. The words on the page blurred together for a moment, but the bold heading stood out clearly: "Notice of violation." The letter was cold, impersonal, and heartless. "The unauthorized structure in your front yard is in violation of community guidelines. Remove the non-compliant installation within 10 days, or face a fine of $100 per day until compliance is met." The unauthorized structure, they meant Ethan's bench, as if his memory, his presence, was nothing more than an inconvenience to their neatly trimmed, uniform neighborhood. Mrs. Wilson read the letter again, hoping she had misunderstood. Surely this was a mistake. Who could possibly have a problem with a simple wooden bench? Who could look at something meant to honor a lost child and see a violation? That evening, when Mr. Wilson came home, she showed him the letter, her voice tight with disbelief. He read it in silence, his jaw clenching, his fingers gripping the paper so tightly it nearly crumpled. Finally, he spoke. "We're not taking it down." There was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt. This wasn't a discussion. It was a decision. Still, they wanted to give the HOA the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps this was an automated notice sent by mistake. Mrs. Wilson called the HOA office the next morning, expecting reason and understanding. But the response she received sent ice through her veins. The woman on the other end of the line spoke in clipped, professional tones, offering no sympathy. "Personal memorials are not in accordance with our community guidelines. Any non-standard yard additions must be pre-approved by the board." Mrs. Wilson's hands tightened around the phone. "It's not a yard addition. It's a memorial for our son." Silence. Then, in the same detached tone, the woman replied, "I understand that this is a difficult situation, but the rules are clear. The bench must be removed, or the fines will begin." The call ended with an automated customer service farewell, and that was it. No compromise, no empathy, just rules. Mrs. Wilson felt a rage she hadn't known she was capable of. When she told her husband what had happened, he didn't say a word. He simply walked outside and sat on a bench, staring out at the street, his hands gripping the edge as if anchoring himself. Neither of them slept much that night. The next morning, another envelope arrived, this time with a larger fine, $500 for noncompliance. The following day, another warning, then another. The Wilsons ignored them. The bench stayed exactly where it was, untouched, unmovable. But the HOA wasn't done. 2 days later, A sharp knock on the door interrupted their dinner. When Mr. Wilson opened it, a woman stood there, dressed in business attire, holding a clipboard like a weapon. "Mr. Wilson, I'm here as a representative of the HOA board. You have been officially warned. If you do not remove the bench immediately, legal action will be taken." Her voice was cool, controlled, as if she were discussing an overdue bill rather than erasing the memory of a child. Mrs. Wilson stepped forward, her voice shaking with fury. "Legal action? Over a bench?" The woman sighed, adjusting her glasses. "This is not personal. It's about maintaining uniformity in the neighborhood." Uniformity. The word hung in the air like a cruel joke. "My son is dead," Mrs. Wilson said, her voice breaking. "That bench is all we have left of him." The woman hesitated for only a moment, just long enough for Mrs. Wilson to see it. A flicker of something behind her eyes. Pity? Shame? But then, just as quickly, it was gone. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, though the words rang hollow. "But the rules apply to everyone." And just like that, she turned and left. The fight had only just begun. At first, the Wilsons thought they were alone in their anger, but then something unexpected happened. A neighbor, an elderly widow named Mrs. Carter, walked over the next day with a determined look in her eye. "This is wrong," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I lost my husband 10 years ago, and the HOA told me I couldn't keep his garden gnome because it wasn't aesthetically pleasing. I gave in. I wish I hadn't." And she wasn't the only one. Other neighbors started whispering, some in quiet support, others in fear of retaliation. But the HOA wasn't backing down, and the fines kept piling up. Then the final blow came, a formal lawsuit filed against the Wilsons. The HOA was taking them to court over their son's memorial. What started as a simple tribute to a lost child had turned into something much bigger. A battle against a system that seemed to care more about grass height and visual harmony than human grief. But the Wilsons weren't going to lose. They couldn't, because this wasn't just about a bench anymore. It was about Ethan. It was about standing up for something bigger than themselves. And soon the world would know about it. The Wilsons knew they were in for a fight, but they didn't realize just how big it would become. The lawsuit wasn't just a legal document, it was a declaration of war. It accused them of violating the HOA's community aesthetic standards, arguing that personal memorials were distracting and could set a precedent for other homeowners. The phrasing was deliberate, cold, designed to make the issue sound like a matter of policy rather than the erasure of a child's memory. The fine had climbed into the thousands, and the HOA was demanding full removal of the bench within 7 days, or else the case would be escalated to county court. The Wilsons had expected resistance, but a lawsuit? Over a bench? It was absurd. It was cruel. And most of all, it was wrong. At first, the Wilsons weren't sure what to do. Hiring a lawyer would be expensive. The fines were already draining their savings, and the idea of entering a lengthy legal battle against a well-funded HOA felt daunting. But then something happened that changed everything. The story broke. It started small. A local newspaper picked it up, running a short article titled "Homeowners Association Sues Family Over Child's Memorial Bench." The journalist, a young woman named Claire, had heard about the case from a friend of a friend and thought it was worth covering. She reached out to the Wilsons, asking if they'd be willing to speak on record. Mrs. Wilson was hesitant at first. They weren't seeking publicity. They weren't looking to turn this into a spectacle. But then she thought about Ethan, about how easily his memory could be erased, and she made her decision. They invited Claire into their home, and for the first time, they told their story in full. They spoke about Ethan, his love for airplanes, the way he would laugh so hard he'd snort, the way he always said "I love you" before going to bed, even when he was too old to think it was cool. They spoke about the bench, how it wasn't just a piece of wood, but a place where they could feel him, where they could hold on to the tiny, fragile pieces of him that still remained. And they spoke about the HOA, about the way they had turned grief into a technicality, about how their son's memory had been reduced to a code violation. The article went live that evening. By the next morning, it had gone viral. Social media exploded. Thousands of people shared the story, expressing outrage at the HOA's heartlessness. Strangers from across the country flooded the Wilsons' inbox with messages of support. A local news station picked up the story, then another, and soon national outlets were calling. People were furious. How could a homeowners association be so cruel? What kind of world did they live in where a grieving family could be punished for remembering their child? But not everyone was on their side. As the media storm grew, the HOA doubled down. Their president, a stern-looking man named Richard Calloway, issued a formal statement, insisting that the lawsuit was not about grief, but about maintaining the integrity of the community. He accused the Wilsons of weaponizing public opinion and deliberately violating community standards. He claimed that if they allowed the bench to stay, it would open the floodgates for other homeowners to start making unapproved modifications to their yards. Today, it's a bench. Tomorrow, it's statues, fountains, personal shrines. We must enforce the rules equally, no matter how emotional the circumstances may be. That was the moment everything shifted. The story was no longer just about one family. It was about power, about the way HOAs wielded authority with zero accountability, about how they buried families in legal fees, about how they used obscure rules to control people's lives. As more people started digging, something shocking came to light. Claire, the journalist who had first interviewed the Wilsons, decided to investigate the HOA itself. What she found was disturbing. For years, homeowners had been silenced, fined, and bullied by the board. One elderly couple had been forced to remove their handmade wooden shutters because they weren't the right shade of brown. A veteran had been threatened with foreclosure over an American flag that was too large. Another family had been fined into bankruptcy because their grass had grown an inch too high after a medical emergency left them unable to mow it. And there was something even worse. Financial records showed that the HOA had been collecting thousands of dollars in violation fines, yet there was no record of where the money had gone. The Wilsons' battle had uncovered something bigger than they ever imagined. Now, people weren't just angry about the bench. They were angry about everything. Angry about the way HOAs operated like unchecked dictatorships, about the way they treated homeowners like tenants instead of property owners, about the way they ruined lives over grass height and holiday decorations. More residents began speaking out, sharing their own horror stories. A petition was started demanding the resignation of the HOA board. Calls flooded the office. News crews showed up to Richard Calloway's house, demanding an explanation. And then an anonymous letter arrived at the Wilsons' door. There was no return address, no signature, just a single page, typed in plain black ink. They aren't just enforcing rules. They're hiding something. Look into Calloway's past. The truth is worse than you think. The Wilsons stare at the letter, a chill running down their spines. What could it mean? What was the HOA really trying to protect? The fight had started as a battle for Ethan's memory, but now it was so much more than that. It wasn't just about the bench. It was about justice. And they weren't backing down. The anonymous letter sat on the Wilsons' kitchen table like a ticking time bomb. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that neither of them could shake. Look into Calloway's past. The truth is worse than you think. Who had sent it? What did it mean? And more importantly, why was the HOA so desperate to bury a grieving family in lawsuits over something as small as a bench? Mrs. Wilson read the letter over and over, searching for any clue in its cryptic message. Mr. Wilson, ever the pragmatist, was skeptical. It could be a hoax, he muttered, rubbing his temples. Some internet stranger stirring the pot. But Mrs. Wilson wasn't convinced. There was something deliberate about the way it had been delivered. No return address. No stamp. It hadn't come through the mail. Someone had physically placed it in their mailbox, under the cover of night, without being seen. That meant whoever had sent it was close, someone in the neighborhood. And they weren't just trying to help. They were warning them. The next morning, Claire, the journalist who had first broken the story, arrived at their house with updates of her own. The deeper she dug into the HOA's financials, the shadier things became. The association had been collecting thousands in violation fines, but the money wasn't being used for community upkeep. There were discrepancies, funds going missing, fines being misreported, and an alarming number of questionable transactions that seemed to benefit only a handful of people. And at the center of it all, Richard Calloway. He had been the HOA president for nearly a decade, but no one really knew much about him. He didn't attend neighborhood gatherings. He wasn't friendly. He enforced rules with an iron fist, but didn't seem to live by them himself. But the real shock came when Claire finally uncovered his past. Calloway wasn't just a bureaucratic tyrant. He had a history of silencing people who crossed him. Years ago, he had been the head of another HOA in a different state, a small Florida community not unlike theirs. There, too, he had imposed strict, suffocating rules, fining residents into submission. Then, one day, a homeowner had challenged him, an elderly man who had built a small memorial fountain in his front yard for his late wife. Calloway had fought tooth and nail to have it removed. It turned into an ugly, drawn-out legal battle, just like what was happening now. The elderly man lost everything. He spent his savings fighting the HOA, fell behind on his mortgage, and was eventually forced out of his own home. And then he disappeared. No one knew what had happened to him. He left town overnight, leaving his house empty. His family never spoke about it, and the case was quietly buried. Shortly after, Calloway resigned from his position and moved out of state. Moved here. Mrs. Wilson's hands trembled as she read the article Claire had uncovered. She looked at her husband, whose jaw was clenched so tightly it looked painful. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that this guy, this man who's suing us over our son's memory, he's done this before?" Claire nodded grimly. "And that's not all." She pulled out a manila folder and slid it across the table. Inside were copies of property deeds, legal complaints, and resignation letters. The pattern was clear. Wherever Calloway went, lawsuits followed. Residents would push back, and they would lose. They would either leave willingly or be pushed out. And the most damning piece of all, a wire transfer receipt. A payment large enough to be hush money had been made to a law firm right before the elderly man disappeared. Silence filled the Wilsons' kitchen. Mr. Wilson exhaled sharply, his hands balled into fists. "That son of a... Why?" Mrs. Wilson whispered, staring at the papers in front of her. "Why would he do this? What does he get out of it?" Claire hesitated. "There's one more thing. Something even darker." She reached into her bag and pulled out another file. "I don't know for sure," she admitted, "but I think it has something to do with this." It was an audit report. One that should have never been made public. It showed that Calloway's HOAs had a pattern of property foreclosures. In multiple cases, families who had been relentlessly fined eventually lost their homes, not because they couldn't afford them, but because the legal fees and penalties buried them in debt. And guess who had purchased several of those foreclosed homes? Calloway's private real estate company. The truth slammed into the Wilsons like a freight train. This wasn't about rules. This wasn't about aesthetics or neighborhood standards. This was a business. The The Wilsons weren't just fighting for their son's memory. They were standing in the way of a calculated scheme, one that had left countless families in ruins. Mrs. Wilson covered her mouth with her hands, horror dawning in her eyes. He's trying to force us out. Mr. Wilson's fists hit the table. We have to stop him. But how? Calloway owned the HOA. He controlled the board. He had deep legal connections. Even if they exposed him, even if they shouted his crimes from the rooftops, the system was designed to protect men like him. Unless... Claire's voice was hesitant, but steady. There's one thing we can do. They turned to her. She took a deep breath. We don't just fight the lawsuit. We take it public. Bigger than before. We put pressure on the county. We bring in state investigators. We turn this into something so big he can't bury it. The Wilsons looked at each other. This was no longer just about Ethan's bench. This was about stopping a predator. It was all or nothing. The Wilsons had a choice. Walk away, take a deal, and let Calloway continue destroying families, or go to war. They already knew their answer. And soon, so would the whole country. The Wilsons didn't sleep that night. Not after what they had learned. Not after seeing, with their own eyes, the horrifying reality behind Richard Calloway's HOA empire. The lawsuit, the relentless fines, the threats. It had never been about Ethan's bench. It had been about money, about power, about control. Calloway had weaponized grief, turning personal tragedies into profit, using his position to push families out and take their homes. And unless someone stopped him, he would keep doing it. Mr. Wilson sat at the kitchen table long after Mrs. Wilson had gone to bed, staring at the evidence spread before him. The man had taken everything from so many people, and now he was coming for them. But what Calloway didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the Wilsons had nothing left to lose. The next morning, they took Claire's advice. They went public. They released the full story, the financial discrepancies, the foreclosures, the vanishing homeowners. They contacted local officials, state regulators, and every major news outlet they could find. And then, just to make sure Calloway couldn't bury it, they leaked the documents online. Within hours, the internet exploded. The Wilsons' battle had already gone viral before, but this was a firestorm. People weren't just angry now. They were furious. Homeowners everywhere started sharing their stories. Former residents from Calloway's previous HOAs came forward, revealing how he had ruined their lives. An online petition calling for his immediate removal hit over 100,000 signatures within a day. Calls flooded the county office, demanding an investigation. And then the real blow came. The state attorney announced they were opening a case against Calloway for fraudulent financial practices and misuse of HOA funds. It should have been the end. But Calloway wasn't done yet. That evening, as the Wilsons sat at home, exhausted but hopeful, their doorbell rang. Mr. Wilson opened it, expecting a neighbor, a reporter, maybe even the police. Instead, standing there, looking more like a cornered animal than a man who had ruled their neighborhood with an iron fist, was Richard Calloway. He wasn't alone. Two men stood behind him, lawyers, judging by their expensive suits and briefcases. "May we come in?" Calloway's voice was hoarse, but controlled. Too controlled. Every instinct in Mr. Wilson's body told him to slam the door in his face. But something about Calloway's expression made him hesitate. Not fear. Not anger. Something worse. Desperation. Mr. Wilson stepped aside. 5 minutes. Calloway nodded and walked in, his lawyers close behind. Mrs. Wilson, sitting on the couch, stiffened at the sight of him, her fists clenching in her lap. Calloway didn't waste time. "Let's make a deal." His voice was low, urgent. Mr. Wilson folded his arms. No deal. Calloway's jaw tightened. He looked at his lawyers, then back at them. You don't understand what's happening here. Mrs. Wilson's voice was ice. Oh, I think we do. Calloway exhaled sharply. You think you've won? He shook his head. You don't know the people I work with. You don't know what's at stake. I can make this go away, for all of us. Mr. Wilson narrowed his eyes. What are you talking about? The HOA president hesitated. Then, finally, he told them. It wasn't just him. Calloway was part of a larger operation, one that had been running for years. HOA boards across the country were being manipulated by a network of private investors, using unpaid fines and foreclosure loopholes to seize high-value properties for pennies on the dollar. Calloway hadn't built the system. He was just one piece of it. And now that the spotlight was on him, the people above him, the ones really running the show, were getting nervous. They weren't going to let him take the fall. They will destroy me, Calloway admitted, his voice cracking for the first time. And then they will come for you. Mrs. Wilson's blood ran cold. Are you threatening us? Calloway shook his head. No, I'm warning you. He leaned forward, his eyes dark. Drop the case. Settle. I can make sure you keep your home. I can even make sure the bench stays. He paused. And I can make you very, very rich. Silence. It hung in the air like poison. Mr. Wilson stared at him, his hands clenching into fists. You're trying to bribe us. I'm trying to save all of us. Mrs. Wilson felt her heart pounding. This was it. The moment. They could take the deal. They could erase the fines, keep their bench, and walk away with more money than they had ever seen. They could win. But at what cost? What about the other families? The ones who had already lost everything? The ones Calloway had crushed? The ones still trapped in this system? Mr. Wilson spoke first. You want us to sell our son's memory to protect your scam? Calloway opened his mouth, but Mr. Wilson cut him off. Get the hell out of my house. Calloway's face darkened. You don't understand what you're doing. Mrs. Wilson stood, her voice steady. No, Richard, you don't understand what you did. For the first time in years, Calloway lost. 2 weeks later, he resigned from the HOA. 3 weeks later, he was indicted on fraud and embezzlement charges. For weeks later, the state cracked down on HOA abuse, passing new protections for homeowners. And in the end, the bench never moved. The Wilsons didn't win the way they expected. They still grieved. They still missed Ethan every day. But they had done something he would have been proud of. They had stood up, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. And in the end, that meant more than any victory money could buy. HOAs control millions of homeowners across America. But who controls them? If this story made you angry, if it made you think, then it's time to take action. Share this story. Tell your lawmakers we need HOA reform. Because no one should lose their home over a bench, and no one should be powerless in their own community.